Hello, ECF. Hope you're doing well. And once again, let's go through the Psalms, Psalm 64 to Psalm 70. And as we look through it, I pray you're encouraged and I pray that you draw closer to God. And as you go through the Psalms, I hope you're spending time on each one, not just trying to rush through it. But let's take a quick look at each one. And what I want to focus on, or what I want you to have in mind, is the concept of privilege, the privilege that we actually have in God. So let's start in Psalm 64. And what I want you to catch from Psalm 64 is that idea of that word refuge, that the concept that the righteous can take refuge in God. Now, that's a term that's used throughout the book of Psalms, the idea of continuously taking refuge, being able to find sanctuary with God, safety in Him. And I think sometimes we take that for granted instead of realizing the great privilege it is that we have refuge in something. Imagine for a moment that you could take refuge in nothing. Yet we get to take refuge not in just something, but someone, and someone who is the greatest in God. So we can take refuge. Psalm 65, in verse about 4, it speaks about the idea of going into his courts. Now, you got to remember, for the psalmist during their time, only a select group of people could go into the courts and into the temple and into a very specific place, the Holy of Holies within the temple. So there was great privilege for those specific people. But for us, we have this privilege in that we get to be with God, we get to approach God like no other because of what Jesus Christ has done for us. And once again, I think we forget that privilege, that we are able to draw close to Him, that we don't have to have a mediator in terms of a priest or in terms of a sacrifice like a lamb, but we have Jesus Christ, who is our mediator and who sacrificed Himself so that we can come and be with the Lord. Psalm 66, very famous little front end here where it says, "Shout for joy to God, all the earth, sing the glory of His name, give to Him glorious praise." And it continues the idea of crying out about how awesome His deeds are. And once again, I think we forget what a wonderful privilege this is. I know I'm similar to you. I imagine for many of you that sometimes worship music can get a bit tiring, or we can have even the question like, why do we do this? It's a bit strange. No one else sings. But we forget the wonderful privilege it is that we get to sing to our God. And when we sing, it's not just lies that we're singing, but we're singing truth. When we say our God is awesome, we're just reiterating what He has already done. And we forget the wonderful privilege it is that we get to sing about how amazing our God is. And so we should remember that, especially when we come into our worship services on a Sunday. Psalm 67, right at the front end of the psalm, it speaks about the idea of may God be gracious to us and bless us and make His face shine upon us. I think too often we take for granted the idea that God forgives us. And so often the case is when we sin, it's the idea, well, I can sin in this way because God will just forgive me. But we forget what an honor and a privilege it is that God would forgive us. And the way His forgiveness works is that His forgiveness is so great that His face could shine upon us. That when we die, we get to approach Him rather than have to hide from Him because of what His Son Jesus Christ is. And once again, a privilege that we frequently forget. We get so worried about other things, we forget the privilege it is that He forgave us. Psalm 68, what I want you to catch here is the privilege of serving a great king. We have many kings in our world. We have presidents, prime ministers, the whole thing. And I imagine you've also had this thought in your mind that you go, well, if I was king, I would help people out. I would be far greater than other people. But we forget that we have a God and a king who already does that. I love what it says in verse 5 of Psalm 68. He is father of the fatherless and protector of widows, is God in His holy habitation. God settles the solitary in a home. He leads out the prisoner to prosperity. Get the picture here that He is the Father. He is the great King of the outcasts. And for those who rebel against Him, well, He punishes. So we get this picture that He is for the outcast, not just the privileged, but rather He gives us privileges, those who are outcast, and helps them. Psalm 69, there's a lot of stuff in there. One of my favorite Psalms. I especially love the idea of having zeal for his house. But I just wanted to focus on one word, and it's this privilege that we have of his love. But I love the explanation and adjectives that Obvious sometimes gives of his love. And here we have the idea of steadfast love. What an amazing thing that we're loved by God, and it's not just a fleeting moment. It's not up and down, but rather it's steadfast, it's consistent. It is something that we can continuously trust in. God's love is steadfast. We need to remember that privilege. And the last privilege in Psalm 70, that short psalm, is the privilege that we get to ask him. And we even get to ask him to be hasty in it, to do it quickly. Now, that doesn't always mean God will do it in our timing, but we have that privilege that we can ask God anything. A God who doesn't have to give us anything, and yet we can ask him. A God that we shouldn't even really be allowed to approach, but a God that loves us and allows us to approach him. And so what I want you to think about, just as you've gone through these Psalms, just remembering the wonderful privilege that you have. And so don't forget that privilege. And so in the rest of this week, remember to approach him, remember to ask of him, remember his forgiveness, his love for you, and just the wonderful privilege you have. You may often look at your life and you go, look at all the things you don't have, but we forget the wonderful privileges God has given us. Have a wonderful week. Bye.